Model 1 conflict statements. That's what this part is all about. And the creation of cognitive and affective, hopefully, dissonance between the pain, the cost of having the dysfunction, and the gain, the benefit, how it serves the patient to have the dysfunction. Model 1. Classical psychoanalysts tend to focus on internal conflict between anxiety-provoking id drives and anxiety-assuaging ego defenses, with the superego coming down usually on the side of the ego. I'll be saving thoughts about the superego and pathogenic interjects more for Model 3. But for now, here, classical psychoanalysts tend to focus on internal conflict between anxiety-provoking id drives and anxiety-assuaging ego defenses. But I've found it to be a little more clinically useful to conceptualize this drive-defense conflict as one that exists between anxiety-provoking, yes, but ultimately empowering forces. Pressing yes, in essence the id, but I'm sort of reframing it as anxiety-provoking, but ultimately empowering and growth-promoting forces pressing yes. On the one hand, and on the other hand, anxiety-assuaging, ego defensive counterforces insisting no. So anxiety-provoking, but ultimately empowering and growth-promoting forces pressing yes, and anxiety-assuaging defensive counterforces protesting no. Alternately stressful conflict statements alternately challenge, thereby provoking anxiety, and then support, thereby easing or assuaging anxiety. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. They first challenge. Now, they can first support, but I've found it a little more, for me, it works a little better first to challenge and then to support. So, they first challenge by speaking to the patient's adaptive, notice that word adaptive, and capacity. Those are healthy, good things. Adaptive capacity to know and anxiety-provoking reality. And I'm going to be giving you a lot of examples. They first challenge by speaking to the patient's adaptive capacity to know, which of course will be to know an anxiety-provoking reality. And then, with compassion and never judgment, they support by resonating empathically with the patient's defensive, get the word defensive need to avoid knowing that uncomfortable or discomforting truth. So these optimally stressful conflict statements first challenge by speaking to the patient's adaptive capacity to know, and then support by resonating empathically with the patient's defensive need to avoid knowing, defensive need not to know the truth about her internal dynamics. All right, be that anxiety-provoking truth, okay, about her internal or relational dynamics, her dysfunctional internal or dysfunctional relational dynamics, or the price she pays for maintaining her defenses, or the therapeutic work she has yet to do. The patient does indeed know on some level about her dysfunction and the price she pays and the therapeutic work she has yet to do. On some level, she does sort of know that, and over time will come to know that more and more. So on some level, she does indeed have the adaptive capacity to know. But, and that's an important word, but she would rather not. And therefore, made anxious, she defends. So Model 1 conflict statements are strategically designed to generate destabilizing tension within the patient between her knowledge of anxiety-provoking but awareness-enhancing, growth-promoting, and ultimately empowering realities that press yes, and the defenses she mobilizes in order to ease that anxiety. Their format, you know that, but you find yourself. So let me say it again. Conflict statements are strategically designed to generate tension, destabilizing tension within the patient between what she knows. She really does on some level know. Her knowledge of various anxiety-provoking but awareness-enhancing, insight-promoting, growth-promoting, and ultimately empowering realities or truths, and the defenses she made anxious, made anxious by that first part of the statement being named, i.e. what she does know that makes her anxious. The defenses she made anxious mobilizes in order to assuage that anxiety. So again, their format will be along the lines of, you know that, but you defensively find yourself. And can you feel that when we say find yourself, we're a little bit helping the patient to avoid having to take full responsibility. So, but you don't want to is a little too aggressive. So we say, but you find yourself feeling that you'd really rather not have to, You know that ultimately you will need to make your peace with the reality that your husband will never be all of who you would have wanted him to be, but you find yourself continuing to hope even so. We get to say that as a conflict statement, even though it's about hope. We'll explain more about this later. And you might think, well, wait a minute, hope, when we talk about relentless hope, isn't that Model 2? Model 2 is about facilitating their grieving as they come to recognize that what they had hoped could be is not actually going to happen, and then they grieve it. But for now, we're dealing with the conflict that they feel between what they do know and what they find themselves feeling as an effort not to have to know. So first I know a little confusing, but we'll give some more examples as we continue. First, the therapist challenges by highlighting an anxiety-provoking reality. And then she supports by resonating empathically with the anxiety-assuaging defense. So you really got to be, it's kind of a cognitive, yeah, kind of. On the other hand, it's also affective and empathic, and you have to be able to resonate and be attuned enough to where the patient is coming from that you'll be able to name on her behalf with compassion and never judgment what you are sensing she finds herself defensively feeling in an effort not to have to confront what she really does know to be the truth. These realities, like the work to be done, or something about her dysfunctional internal dynamics, or the price she pays for being the way she is. Okay. You know that, but you find yourself. So here the therapist, again, repeating, first challenges by speaking directly to the patient's observing ego or reflecting ego. Again, classical psychoanalytic, the language of ego. Not self, which is Model 2, or self in relation, which is Model 3. So classical psychoanalytic, we're going to use the terminology. You could say observing self, but I'm going to say observing ego because it's sort of more classical psychoanalytic. So the therapist first challenges by speaking directly to the patient's observing ego and adaptive capacity to know some painful truth, which will increase the patient's anxiety. Now, let me say, I haven't emphasized this yet, but I'm going to in a moment. It's not that the therapist names what the therapist knows but rather names what the patient knows, what the patient has the adaptive capacity to know, at least on some level. You know that. So we're not saying, well, you could ask your parents for the money in order to continue the treatment. You say, you know that you could choose to ask your parents for the money to continue the treatment, but you find yourself thinking, no, I'm already too tied to them already, owe them too much already, I'm not going to go there, don't want to do it. All right, but so it's not right. So we don't say, well, you could ask your parents for the money. We say, you know you could ask, but you would rather not because you find yourself thinking, no, I don't want any further ties or any further, ties that would bind me to them. Okay, first challenge, but then supports by resonating empathically with the patient's experiencing ego. So observing ego in the first part and adaptive capacity, and now experiencing ego and defensive need to deny such knowing, which will decrease the patient's anxiety. So the therapist offers these statements: first challenge, then support. First increase anxiety, then decrease it. First speak to the observing ego, then the experiencing ego. First speak to the patient's adaptive capacity, and then the patient's defensive need. The patient does indeed know, but would rather not, and therefore made anxious, she defends. So she does know on some level about the internal dysfunctional dynamics, the dysfunctional internal dynamics. She does know. She knows all sorts of things, but made anxious, would rather not. And so she defends and finds herself thinking, feeling, or doing whatever she must in order to preserve the status quo, no matter how dysfunctional, of things. And remember Charles Krebs, self-organizing systems, open systems, complex adaptive systems, chaotic systems resist perturbation, sort of like a rubber band, and it's sitting there on the table and you kind of pull it out, it goes back. So self-organizing systems resist perturbation. So we challenge her with some growth, some anxiety, some growth promoting, but anxiety provoking truth. But we stretch the rubber band out. But she, made anxious, finds herself no, thinking, feeling, or doing whatever she must in order to preserve the dysfunctional status quo of things internally. Okay. Anxiety-provoking but ultimately awareness-enhancing interventions, i.e. conflict statements. First, the reality, what the patient really does know, at least on some level. Now, you can't cheat and say something that she really doesn't know, but something that at least on some level she does know. And then the defense, the resistance. In other words, what is what is fueling the defense, the resistance, to the knowing. You know that ultimately you'll need to let Jose go because he, like your dad, really isn't available in the way that you would have wanted him to be. Now, let me say, does she know this? I mean, yeah. On some level, she does know that Jose breaks her heart. Jose, like her dad, who did. Jose now breaks her heart again and again and again because he really isn't available in the way that she would have wanted him to be. Does she know this? Yes. Does it make her anxious? Yes. You know, but she does know this. You know she has the adaptive capacity to know that ultimately you'll need to let, or you could throw in, you'll probably end up letting Jose go. You could say that. You can modify this in any way you want. Because he, like your dad, throw in the little bit of the genetic underpinnings if you'd like, really isn't available in the way that you would have wanted him to be. But, and now we get to the second part of the conflict statement, but for now, and you're going to find that I often use the temporal element of for now, but for now, so suggesting that perhaps at some later point it could be different. Anyway, but for now, or at least at the moment, all you can think about is how desperately, in order for us to say this, we needed to be empathically entering into her experience and taking it on as if it were our own, so that it will indeed ring true for her. But for now, all you can think about is how desperately you want to be with him and how horrible it would be to lose him. And there you're going to ease her anxiety, because you're letting her know that you understand why she can hardly bear to think about letting him go, because she would be it would be so horribly devastating were she to lose him. Okay, second one. You know that eventually you can highlight that you know that right now you need to. No, you can say eventually. I hadn't even realized that I automatically put that in there. I'll be damned. All right, yeah. You know that ultimately, you know that eventually, you know that someday. That's interesting. It makes it easier for the patient, even though you then go on to sort of sock it to them, what they really do know. You know that eventually you will need to make your peace with the reality of just how limited your mother is. Do they know that on some level? Of course they do. But your fear, now here's the defense, you're going to resonate empathically with what you know they mobilize in order not to have to go there. But your fear is that were you ever to let yourself really feel the pain of that, you would never recover. A third one, you know that someday you'll have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. Sort of like, duh. But right, so you know that someday you'll have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. So much more powerful that than if you sit there opposite them and you say, you're going to have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. And then they say, oh, no, but I don't want to risk being that vulnerable. So what you do is you name what they know, and then you name how they would have protested. But in the moment, there's that temporal element. The thought of making yourself that vulnerable is simply intolerable. There's no way you're willing to run the risk of being hurt ever again. So you see how we both challenge by naming something that they do know and that ultimately will be growth promoting and transformation promoting. They do need to, if they ever want to have a meaningful relationship, they will have to let somebody in. They do know that that they ultimately need to make their peace with the reality of just how limited their mother is, instead of continuing to hope against hope that maybe their mother will change and then beating on their mother to change. They do know that they need to do that, but they would rather not have to. So we are zeroing in on their internal neurotic conflictedness between what they really do know, anxiety provoking but growth promoting ultimately, and what they find themselves defensively feeling because they've been made so anxious and they would really rather not know. So just as with the ever-evolving sandpile model of chaos theory, so too the Model 1, and I'm now going to call her the interpretive therapist, the Model 1 interpretive therapist will be generating iterative cycles of disruption and repair by way of strategically designed conflict statements that alternately challenge and then support, thereby providing both impetus and opportunity for the Model 1 patient, i.e. the resistant patient, the Model 1 resistant patient, to evolve incrementally from defensive resistance to ever higher levels of adaptive awareness. So from defense to adaptation, from resistance, the defense starts with the letter R, to awareness or insight, starts with the letter A. Ongoing challenge and then support with these optimally stressful conflict statements designed to facilitate the development of dual awareness. I'm introducing that term now. It's a wonderful something that we hope our patients will be able to develop over time. So on the one hand, they will know something with their, we could now introduce, we could say observing ego, or we could say with their the analytic wisdom of their left brain, what they have the adaptive capacity to know. And then on the other hand, the emotional reactivity harbored within the right brain. The more experiencing right brain. So dual awareness between present and past, between left brain and right brain, between observing ego and experiencing ego, between reflecting ego and participating ego, dual awareness, being able to hold in mind simultaneously an awareness of two sides of the same coin. So these conflict statements: anxiety provoking, then anxiety assuaging; cognitive, more interpretive, then affective, more empathic; head, then heart; knowledge, what they do know, and then experience; objective and then subjective; observing ego, then experiencing ego; adult, here and now, then child, there and then; rational and then irrational; response, then reaction; left brain, then right brain; adaptive capacity, then defensive need; adaptation, then defense. Whew. I'm glad that worked out. All right, some more. You know that ultimately you will need to confront and grieve the reality that Tom is not available in the ways that you would have wanted him to be, and that until you make your peace with that painful reality, you will continue to be miserable. So that's the work to be done. So the painful reality that Tom is not available, and then the work to be done is make her peace with the painful reality that she will continue to be miserable until she indeed makes her peace. But here's the second part. In the moment, all you can think about is how angry you are that he doesn't tell you more often that he loves you. So you start the sentence, the first half, you know that ultimately, right? But in the moment. Wow, that is interesting. Yeah, you know that ultimately, eventually, someday. Interesting. But in the moment. But at this point in time. But right now. All right, you know that you won't feel truly fulfilled until you are able to get your thesis completed. But you continue to struggle, fearing that whatever you might write just wouldn't be good enough or capture well enough the essence of what you're trying to say. So you have so entered into their experience that you understand what it is that holds them back. You know that you won't feel truly fulfilled until you are eventually able to get your thesis completed. But you continue to struggle, fearing that whatever you might write just wouldn't be good enough or capture well enough the essence of what you are trying to say. And you know that if your relationship with Ilana is to survive, you will need to take at least some responsibility for the part you are playing in the incredibly abusive fights that you and she are having. And here we're speaking to, it's a relational dynamic that's getting played out, but in the moment with this conflict statement, we're speaking to its internal manifestation. Her knowing something, or it's a him, his knowing something, but refusing to sort of let himself be present with that knowledge. So it's still an internal dynamic that we're focusing on. You know that if your relationship, your external relationship or relatedness with Ilana is to survive, you will need to take at least some responsibility for the part you are playing in the incredibly abusive fights that you and she are having. But you tell yourself that it isn't really your fault, because if she weren't so provocative, then you wouldn't have to be so vindictive. And the patient says, exactly. That is actually a sentence that I said to a patient. Exactly. Right. And I then went on to say, in fact, if you find yourself feeling the need, then you can get pretty ugly if you have to. And the patient said, exactly. Exactly. So that there you are so entering into their experience. You don't say it in a judgmental way. You sort of really get it. That if they feel wronged or abused or provoked in some way, then they feel it's their right to fight back, to get vindictive, to retaliate. And you get that. You say it in a compassionate, non-judgmental way. And they go, exactly, and they feel deeply understood. And they're being deeply understood because you do get it. It reminds me a little bit, this isn't quite the same thing, but during my training at the Cambridge Health Alliance way back decades ago, I was assigned a patient who had raped a number of women, and he had done time in jail, although not forever, not for life, but had done time in jail. And he was then assigned to me by the powers that be. But I want to say that, and initially it's like, oh my God, I have to work with a serial rapist. Like, oh, that's horrifying, so much for my countertransference. But over time, indeed, I did come to understand why it is that he felt the need to rape women. It's not for me to judge. I was not judging. Empathy is not about judgment. It's not about, well, it's good or bad. It's just truly entering into the patient's experience. We'll be saying more about this later. And taking on their experience as if it were your own and coming to understand their world through their eyes. And I came to understand why it is that he raped. It's very, very interesting. So empathy, when done, from your heart and in continuously and non-judgmentally and compassionately is a beautiful gift that you can offer a patient and yourself, quite frankly. By calling the patient's attention to the conflict that exists within her between whatever objective reality that she knows with her head and the subjective experience that she feels with her heart, Model 1 conflict statements can be strategically formulated to precipitate defensive disruption, because they challenge, in order to trigger disruption, in order to trigger ultimately adaptive, reconstitutive repair. So conflict statements very clearly aim to generate these recursive, iterative cycles of defensive collapse and adaptive repair, defensive collapse and adaptive repair at ever higher levels of awareness about one's dysfunctional internal dynamics. Now, we're going to get eventually to what that awareness can then lead to. And it has to do with the dissonance between the pain that they're now coming to recognize and the gain. Pain and gain, the stress and strain of the dissonance between the pain and the gain. But I'm ahead of myself here. Some more. You know that eventually you'll need to face the reality that your mother was never really there for you, and that you won't get better until you let go of your hope that maybe someday you'll be able to make her change. We're speaking to the patient's relentless hope. But this is not a patient who is about to start grieving. She is still needing not to. She is holding on to her relentless hope, refusing to confront the reality of the mother's limitations. So you know eventually you'll need to face the reality that she was never really there for you, and that you won't get better until you let go of your hope that maybe someday, somehow, some way, you'll be able to make her change. But you're not quite yet ready to deal with all the pain around that, because you're afraid that you might never survive the heartbreak and despair you would feel were you to face that devastating reality. And here we're completely getting it, why they refuse to grieve, because they're not sure they would survive the heartbreak, devastation, and despair. You know that your need for your children to understand your perspective might be a bit unrealistic. Do they know that? On some level, yes. Does it make them anxious to acknowledge it? Yes, it does. They'd really rather not go there, but they do know it on some level. but you tell yourself that you have a right to their respect, by golly, and to their forgiveness. One of my supervisees, we ended up having her give that statement to her patient, who kept insisting that the children understand his perspective, and sort of like, not going to happen. You tell yourself you have a right to their respect and their forgiveness, and that is exactly what he told himself, even though he did know on some level that it was unrealistic for him to be expecting that kind of understanding from his children. You're coming to understand that your anger can put people off. So we don't just say to them, your anger can put people off. We say, you're coming to understand. Or we could say, you're gradually coming to understand or to appreciate that your anger can put people off. But you tell yourself that you have a right to be as angry as you want because of how much you have suffered over the years. Can you feel how this sort of captures both sides of their ambivalence, their ambivalent attachment to their dysfunctional internal dynamic or conflict? You know that if you're ever to win, you know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go of your conviction that your childhood scarred you forever. But it's hard not to feel like damaged goods when you grew up in a horribly abusive household with a mean and nasty mother who was always calling you a loser. Exactly, they say, exactly. And then you can go back to, but you know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go eventually of your conviction that you are so damaged from way back that you really can't move forward. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, the last slide. At the end of the day, in this part, in order to increase the patient's awareness of her ambivalent attachment to her dysfunction, the Model 1 interpretive therapist first challenges by highlighting what the patient is coming to understand as the price she pays for clinging to her dysfunction, a price paid that fuels her aggressive cathexis of the defense. Kind of big words there, but anyway, a price paid that fuels her aggressive cathexis of the defense. And then supports by resonating empathically with what the therapist is coming to understand as the investment the patient has in holding on to her dysfunction even so. An investment in that fuels her libidinal cathexis of the defense. This is just sort of to highlight that there's an ambivalent attachment to the defense. It both costs her, there's a price paid, thus the aggressive cathexis of the defense, but it also benefits her. She has an investment in it. It serves her, and thus her libidinal cathexis or investment in the defense. In other words, an ambivalent attachment to the dysfunction, to the defense. And we need to appreciate that always, that a patient wouldn't have the dysfunction or the defense or the symptom or the problem, but for the fact that it both serves her, and thus her investment in it, and although admittedly it does cost her, which is what she will be complaining about, there is a price paid. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in an effort to make the ambivalently held defense ever less ego-syntonic and ever more ego-dystonic, which is in Model 1 what we really want to have happen. Use of the word ego from syntonic, where it serves the patient, even though it's dysfunctional, to dystonic, where the patient's recognizing increasingly the price paid for clinging to the dysfunctional defense.